Hello and welcome to The Time of Telling. I'm Mark Walker, and this podcast is based on my unpublished manuscript, The Time of Telling, John Starr Cook and the Word of One Tarot. In the previous episode, the Ouija board sessions had stopped and John was making plans to move to Mexico. The final session was in mid-November 1963, and a week later came the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy, and the entire nation, the entire US, was suddenly in shock. Now, on that day, Michael McCracken was on LSD and had wandered away from the abalone factory. He walked into a fish bar where an ashen-faced, mute crowd were gathered around a television. It was the wrong place and the wrong time to burst out in hysterical laughter. McCracken was severely beaten and thrown into the water and left for dead. Over a period of several hours, he managed to drag himself back to the abalone factory, where Bowen found him, called Dr. Wenneslaan, who came at once and tended to him. Meanwhile, John lingered on at Amaranthus. Peter stayed with him for some months into 1964. Rosalind was still living in the gatehouse. Mitch was living in San Francisco and would come up on weekends. The big Sir artist crowd of beat painters and other seekers were regularly at John's place. Mitch observes that these were true seekers. There were no faux hipsters. This was a serious scene, as the beat movement generally was. The consumption of psychedelics was not just for kicks, but it was another means of asking the question, who am I? But of course, none of them had money, and John was a generous host. Food, drink, drugs, all of the things that beats need. Now, John was convinced by someone that he should consult a cancer specialist in Carmel. The specialist examined the wound on his neck and diagnosed cancer. Now, we haven't talked about the wound on John's neck as yet, but we'll be going into that in some detail shortly. The surgeon operated on John's shoulder and removed some material, and this was declared a success, but John was unsure. Peter and Mitch each separately headed to Europe around April 1964. Peter, the talented poet, for some reason, burnt all of his poetry before he left. He intended to visit Rome, but soon wound up on a different track, as we will see. Mitch, meanwhile, set off on a Swedish freighter with 11 passengers on an 11-day trip to Stockholm. From Stockholm, Mitch hitchhiked down through Berlin, where he found himself in with the gallery crowd, and to Paris. Peter spent only a few weeks in Rome before setting off for Kathmandu, Nepal, on the Buddhist path. Now, John had provided Mitch with an introduction to his old friend from the Tangier days, Brian Gysin, who is living at number 9 Rue, I can't pronounce these properly, Get Le Couture, in one of the 42 small, shabby rooms with the bathroom down the hall, by then known among the Beat generation as the Beat Hotel. The Beat Hotel was a cheap rooming house in Paris where various Beats stayed over the years. Brian Gysin was associated with many of these figures, and to find out about Gysin's relationship with John Cook, we will have to go back to Tangier, Morocco in the 1950s. In late 1954, a new restaurant opened in Tangier called the 1001 Nights. Over the centuries, Tangier had been conquered by Berbers, Phoenicians, Romans, Arabs, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and French. Tangier by this stage was not a part of Morocco, but was rather an international enclave within it, holding special status as an international city in the wake of the Great War. By late 1954, there were considerable rumblings for Moroccan independence. The restaurant was the brainchild of author and painter Brian Gysin. Gysin had spent summer in Morocco a few years earlier with his friend, then composer Paul Bowles, who found early success in a new career as an author. Bowles's debut novel, The Sheltering Sky, had been a bestseller, and its success allowed him to purchase a residence in Tangier. Bowles and Gysin had attended a music festival on the beach near Tangier, and here Gysin heard music that he wanted to hear every day for the rest of his life. Mohammed Hamri helped Gysin to track the musicians down to their home village, Jujouka, where he witnessed what he believed was a continuation of the Roman Lupercalia, where the great god Pan parades through the streets pursuing virginal women. Somewhere along the way, they became known as the master musicians of Jujouka. The master musicians of Jujouka are Sufi trance musicians from the village of Jujouka who play 1,000-year-old music. The musicians suggested to Gysin that he open a little cafe where they could provide the music. Some of Gysin's friends owned a palace in Tangier, and Gysin was able to set up shop in a wing of this palace. Gysin's enterprise began in late 1954 and was prosperous for a time. The final days of the Interzone, to use Burroughs' term from The Naked Lunch, would be in play. But for a time, the 1001 Nights was a great success with the international crowd. However, the movement for Moroccan independence was gathering, and as the special status of Tangier as an international city was coming to an end, many of the expats returned home. It was at this point that John and Mary Cook walked into the 1001 Nights restaurant and met Gysin. He described it as a godsend to his faltering finances. John, who owned an apartment in Tangier, recalls the first encounter he and Mary had with Gysin in spring 1955, probably in March. Now this is quoting John. Mary and I had been living down in the desert, in a cave in Tamanrasset, and had driven up to Tangier, where we stayed in the apartment for the first time together. We met Brian Gysin the first evening we were there, and became very close friends immediately. Gysin recalls, the two of them had come floating into my restaurant, the 1001 Nights in Tangier, telling me that they had been on my trail for a long time. Their Ouija board had sent them across the Sahara, looking for a man whose name is not Brahim, the name my musicians call me to this day. Very early in the evening, the customers usually came to dinner at 9 or 10, or some such hour as that, and at about 7 o'clock, my head waiter came to me and said, "There are some very strange people downstairs looking for you." I saw this pair dressed up in all kinds of campy desert gear, and him with the shaven head and the sort of beard cut in a particularly Arab fashion very short, just like a 2-day growth of beard, cutting a very sharp pattern on his face, and her billowing in all kinds of veils and bangles, billowing huge in all kinds of veils and bangles and spangles and everything else like that. And they just came floating in, giving me the impression that they were really magic people, and that they had all of these things at their fingertips, most particularly money. "Guess where we came from, and guess who we are," said John. Gyson continues, "They were the first rich hippies I had ever seen, in sandals and saris and sarouels, but dripping with real jewels of great price, in the best possible taste, paying cash and drinking only champagne. I was swept away by this godsend to my faltering finances. My restaurant was staggering to a full stop after Tangier lost its independence and became part of Morocco again. The cooks became the stars of my late show. They gave parties and sent people or dragged people there just about every night they were in town. John Cook was a real sweet cat, a real gas. He was funny and flip and fearless and fey as the light-footed little people. Moroccans immediately dug him for a natural, a real janoon, or even a majdoubi, a holy madman. Sorry for getting those words wrong. He had great big Buddha ears sticking out on both sides of a wide grin full of great big square teeth, and big bugged out green eyes, laughing like crazy. He shaved his head, of course, and went barefoot, wearing jewels on his big toes. He could sign a check with his right foot, and often did, for any amount that was needed. John Cook gave Brian Gyson an enormous emerald. This emerald was to form a central part of the story of his novel, The Process, representing the end of word. John had recently backed away from his association with the Naqshbandi Sufi order and Islam. The Process depicts this through Thay, who is John's alter ego in the book, and the Hamadsha, who stand in for the Naqshbandi. So, quoting from The Process, this is Thay relating. I'd gotten in deep with the Hamadsha before it really dawned on me that all my new Moroccan friends took it for granted that I was a Muslim, or was about to become one. When someone intoned slowly for me to repeat, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet," I said it. Why not? In the narrative, Thay spends a night with the Hamadsha Brotherhood in Moulay Yunus, a holy Muslim city where no Christian had spent a night in over 1,000 years, before going to the tomb of the Sufi saint Sidi Hassan, where Thay was to be initiated. In real life, John visited the ancient city of Fez with the Naqshbandi order of Tuareg Sufis. Fez was founded by Moulay Idris, who has a mausoleum and shrine where non-Muslims are not permitted. Fez is built around his mausoleum. Every year there is a religious festival in his honour around September, where a procession of brotherhoods go dancing through the Medina, dancing, singing, playing, and blessing the faithful. Fez was a city centred on a saint. John was looked upon by the Brotherhood as some kind of a living saint. Many of the saints of Fez had visions there, and John had a vision at Fez too. John was pinned to the ground by the lance of a Templar knight mounted on horseback, This is John's vision. And the Templar Knight thundered to John, "You are a Christian, not a Muslim." John was deeply shaken by this, and it was a pivotal moment where he deliberately backed away from the order. It was expected by the Naqshbandi that he was, or was soon to be, Muslim. There was to be an initiation, which was only for Muslims. But John had no intention of becoming a Muslim. He would not be joining the Brethren on their pilgrimage this year. This decision would not be without consequence. On Easter Sunday, the 10th of April 1955, John and Mary were at the 1001 Nights with Guyson when Guyson announced to them, "You know, the Easter Bunny has just appeared in my restaurant." A rabbit had shown up out of nowhere. Guyson showed it to the cooks, then took it back upstairs and put it in his room. Subsequently, the rabbit disappeared, and the next morning, Guyson telephoned the cooks in hysterics. Somehow, the rabbit had found its way out of a locked room. Guyson had discovered it outside his window, fried to death on the electricity wires. As far as omens go, it did not look good. The Naqshbandi Sufi order, with whom John had been running off and on for over 3 years, were not happy that John was not going to become a Muslim and that he would be moving to Algeria. According to John's sister Alice, there were a pair of disturbing encounters with Brotherhood members or associates. Firstly, John was accosted by a sweeper while he was down getting his ticket, as Alice put it, presumably an air ticket to Algiers. The sweeper was a member of the order, and as stated before, they were unhappy with John backing away from the group and from Islam. Alice states, "He joined a very strict Muslim sect that said, 'Once in, you can't get out.' He wanted out because he realized it was black magic. Well, maybe not black magic, but something much too powerful for him. He didn't want it." The sweeper queried John, "Oh, you're leaving?" John replied, "Yes, I am," and went to move forward, but the sweeper barred his way. "You cannot leave, Rashid Sufi," said the sweeper, and John had to push past him. This is the name that John was known as to his Naqshbandi brothers, Rashid Sufi. So John pushed past the sweeper and bought his air ticket. Soon afterwards, John went to the bank to cash a cheque, where there was an even more sinister encounter. Alice describes it. Then he went to the bank, and another one of the followers of this Muslim crowd had given him a silk scarf, and he had it on for the very first time. Okay, it wasn't actually a silk scarf, but never mind. John was standing in line when the mother of one of the brethren, a cleaner scrubbing the floor, tugged on his trouser leg to get his attention. At the same time, another woman placed a green nylon scarf around his neck. John thought that this was a parting gift from friendlier members of the Brotherhood. But as he was leaving the bank, John suddenly felt intense pain, as though he had been struck by a blast of electricity or lightning or stung by a scorpion, and he ripped off the scarf and opened his shirt. There was a great big red mark, a very bad burn. John went to a doctor who said it was some kind of allergy and asked what he was wearing. "A green nylon scarf," replied John. "That's it. You're allergic to nylon. It will go away. Don't worry, said the doctor. John was given some salve to rub on it, and the mysterious burn gradually diminished over a period of weeks until it was just one little point of red, and he thought nothing more about it. However, that little point of red never fully cleared up, and the repercussions of this unnerving occasion stayed with John Cook for the remainder of his life. Indeed, they ultimately brought it to a premature conclusion 2 decades hence. But for the time being, the strange shoulder burn seemed to be under control, and John's life continued. Now, getting back to the 60s, when Mitch visited Brian Gyson at the Beat Hotel in April 1964, Gyson was in his final months at this place. Burroughs had moved on to London already. The Beat Hotel was going to be refurbished and made too expensive for me, as Gyson wrote to Paul Bowles. Now, although Mitch had an introduction from John, this alone was not enough to be in with Gyson. After introductions were made, Gyson produced a joint, which they smoked, and then another. Gyson's residence was of 2 rooms. Mitch describes Gyson disappearing into the other room and returning with one of his paintings. He thrust it in front of Mitch's face. "What do you see?" he demanded. Mitch was very stoned. The pulsating squiggles of Gyson's painting suddenly morphed into a bullfight. "That was what got me in," says Mitch, describing Gyson as taking him under his capacious wing. Gyson, however, was still stung and somewhat mystified by his experience at the 1001 Nights some years earlier. Gyson seems to have included John as a player in the drama of his loss of the 1001 Nights, and as such found it hard to understand why John would be sending someone to him. Now, again, we need to go back to Tangier to explain how Gyson lost his restaurant. So, in mid-August, John and Mary arrived in London, mid-August 1955. Now, L. Ron Hubbard and his wife Mary Sue were also visiting in London, and together with John and Mary, the 4 shared dinner at a small eating house in Chelsea. The discussion fell to Hassan-i Sabar, the old man of the mountain, and for some reason Ron chided John, which made him furious. John thought that nobody else at the table even knew who Hassan was. "In fact, I believe LRH believed he wrote the Arabian Nights," said John later. A decade hence, John would himself become a veritable old man of the mountain, at the head of a new order of Hashashim, the Psychedelic Rangers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. While in the UK, the Cooks also visited Glastonbury and Scotland, where they visited Willie Merson, with whom John Cook had lived in Eritrea. The Cooks spent their first Christmas at Sunakay, in the great house Mary had bought near Algiers. The extensive renovations and refurbishments were now complete, and they could live there in luxury between bouts of exploration. A key motivation that John and Mary shared, and which should be mentioned, was their opposition to the testing of nuclear weapons in Africa. According to Chamba, They intended to do all they could to save Africa from the bomb by bringing up the subject when in influential company, which happened from time to time. In January 1956, they were back in the cave at Tamanrasset. Perhaps John had swung the pendulum again, for once again he went from one extreme to the other, trading the Sahara sands for the fjords of Finnmark. In February, John set off to meet Axel Jensen in Norway. Now, we'll have to go into the story of Axel at another time, the background. But for now, John and Axel travelled together once again to the far northern province of Finnmark, and this time they went as far as the Russian border. It was a short trip this time, as John did not have a visa to Finland. And John was back in Africa in March. And with Mary, they visited Luxor, Cairo, and Jerusalem. They returned to Cairo and spent April there. Many years later, John revealed that when he was in Cairo at this time, he made representations to officials on behalf of Palestinian refugees in Jordan. The first Arab-Israeli war in 1948 had created hundreds of thousands of refugees, with King Hussein of Jordan taking in a great number. However, conditions in the refugee camps were diabolical. Here's John quoting. In 1956, I tried my best to get so-called influential people interested in those refugees. Talk about a group living under pressure. I'll never forget nor forgive their cities, nor a Coptic bigwig who advised me to shut up for the sake of the Arab world. At that time, Nasser was a Coptic puppet. John and Mary's long trip continued when they spent Easter, Sunday the 23rd of April, in Eritrea, presumably at Willie Merson's. By June, they were back in Tangier, living large at the 1001 Nights. Guyson recalls John's dancing prowess. He was a great dancer and did whirling dervish dances in California style, whizzing like a top across the marble floor of my restaurant until he skidded on water or something and nearly stove in one side of his skull against a table. He was out like a light for quite a spell, but came back stronger than ever with his big, silly, lovable grin. It was around this time that the writer William S. Burroughs says he had a fleeting encounter with the Cooks. Burroughs was at the 1001 Nights, waiting for a friend to pay the bill, when he noticed John and Mary. There was something portentous about it, he said, as though I was seeing them in another medium, like they were sitting there as holograms. Burroughs was at this time writing the routines that would become Naked Lunch. The little red point on John's shoulder grew more inflamed, and John had it looked at. The diagnosis was rheumatism. The Cooks remained in Tangier until the 20th of June, when they again went to London to see Meher Baba, who was scheduled to appear there on the 1st of July. However, Baba's plans changed and he remained in India until the 16th of July, and the Cooks missed seeing him. That's another backstory we'll have to go into later, the story of Meher Baba and his relationship with John. While in London, the Cooks caught up with Anthony Lickiard. John's interest in the tarot had led to him learning that Aleister Crowley's personal tarot cards were for sale. John was interested in buying them, but Lickiard warned him against it. Crowley's enduring reputation as an evil black magician had convinced Lickiard that it would not end well, but John would not be dissuaded. Lickiard's son, Alexis Lickiard, recalls, "Hi, Alexis. I have a schoolboy recollection from 1956 of a weirdly exotic pair of American Scientologists visiting our London flat. They were John Starr Cook and his wife Mary, over from Tangier. My father was then also involved in Dianetics and Scientology, something he would later totally deny. At that time, however, he blithely assumed his customary patriarchal role as sage, warning this wealthy seeker after truth against purchasing Crowley's annotated tarot pack. He predicted the direst of consequences if Cook did so. While the Cooks visited Anthony, they took the teenage Alexis out in his blue serge public school suit to a kabuki performance at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. Alexis remembers Mary as a big, exotic woman, spectacularly theatrical, with bangles, open sandals, and lots of kohl around her eyes. A sight such as Mary was not usual in 1950s London. Alexis found John rather camp and thought that they may have fancied him. Overall, he found the whole evening rather embarrassing and awkward. For instance, they could afford a cab, but had insisted on taking a bus and sitting up top, attracting considerable attention with their loud, colourful Americanness in a grey, post-war city still on rations and with many wartime ruins still visible. The Cooks left London, heading back to Algeria with Aleister Crowley's tarot cards. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Thank you very much for watching. This is The Time of Telling.